at one point of time, but he, more importantly, served in our Indian embassies in Afghanistan, Washington, Egypt, and as a Charge d'Affaires in Houston. He's been our ambassador in Kuwait and the ambassador and permanent representative to the UN in Geneva. He's also been involved with human rights and was the honorary advisor to the Director General of the World Intellectual Property Organization. And currently, he is the founding director of Tech Foundation, which is a not-for-profit outfit catering for the visually impaired community. And although he's also been the private secretary to the Vice President of India in the past, the fact that he is involved in helping the visually impaired, I wonder if he can, show us some vision for the immediate future for India and Afghanistan.
Mandy always has to end with a pun.
There you go, Swash. So the floor is yours for the next 6-7 minutes for your opening comments, and then we'll bring in our other panelists too. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Mandy. I was told we're supposed to talk about options for India, and then by implications for India as well. So there is only one option for India as far as I'm concerned. It must remain engaged with Afghanistan under all circumstances. We've been part of the history of this country through good times and through difficult times. It has been an important strategic partner, and there have been periods of strain, but with changing circumstances, we have found ways to re-engage and work with them. So looking ahead, Afghanistan emerged as a country in mid-18th century. Ahmed Khan carved out a buffer between Persia and a crumbling Mughal empire. It later evolved into a buffer zone between Tsarist Russia and British India. With the dissolution of the former Soviet Empire in Central Asia and the gradual weakening of the Pakistani state, a historic realignment is now taking place that could, in time, see Afghanistan in its present form disappear on the political map. The Hindu Kush, the real western frontier of the subcontinent, could form a border between de facto Pashtunistan and the greater Tajikistan. Saleh Harrison, well-known expert in the region, suggests that the Taliban, the upshot of Pashtun nationalism, Islamic fervor, drug money, and corrupt warlords, may become the vehicle for this transition. There are those who believe that Afghanistan is, in terms of geography, barely a country at all. It is riven by towering mountain ranges within its territory, which helps seal divisions between the Pashtuns themselves and Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras, Turkmens, and other minorities. On the other hand, there is little by way of natural impediments that separates Afghanistan from Pakistan or Afghanistan from Iran. More than half the world's 42 million Pashtuns live in Pakistan. One could construct a country called Pashtunistan, lying between the Hindu Kush Mountains and the Indus River, thus overlapping the states of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Afghanistan is a geographical buffer between the Iranian plateau, the Central Asian steppes, and the Indian subcontinent, breathtakingly strategic, and has thus been coveted not just by Russia, but also by Iran and Pakistan, even as Indian policymakers have been obsessed with it. Afghanistan geography makes it central not only as a principal invasion route into India for terrorists in our day, as for armies in days past, but as a strategically vital rare base for Pakistan. The vast region today that encompasses northern India, along with much of today's Pakistan, was commonly under a single polity. Thus, for India, think of not only Pakistan, but also Afghanistan as India's home turf is not only natural, but historically justified. The tomb of Babur is in Kabul, not in Delhi. For India, an Afghanistan that falls under the Al-Qaeda and Taliban's sway threatens to create a succession of radicalized Islamic societies from the India-Pakistan border up to Central Asia. It could also result in a radical, destabilized Pakistan, divided along its fault lines of de facto Pashtunistan, Baluchistan, and Sindh, with the landlocked Punjab in a fractured geography. So in this context then, from a realpolitik perspective, given the alternatives, de facto partition of Afghanistan is the only realistic policy option available. USA initiated disorderly withdrawal of all American and NATO forces from Afghanistan as part of an ill-advised, hurried, and one-sided agreement. This has created the real prospect of all-out Afghan civil war. It could lead to the Taliban's probable but bloody conquest of the entire country. This could also draw in Afghanistan's neighbors, which could result in ultimately destabilizing the entire region. It could also dramatically increase the likelihood of the Islamic radicalization of Pakistan in the Pashtun areas and Balochistan, the dramatic increase in refugee inflows with its economic and social disruptions will add to further destabilizing a sensitive and volatile region. It could also call into question the security of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. It's also likely to trigger wider support for Islamic extremist ideology and increased terrorism against liberal societies in the region. Realistically, then, a de facto partition enforced by external intervention and internal opposition could become a viable option. Tribal leaders on the Pashtun periphery who may decide to resist the Taliban would need to be supported and strengthened. The Pashtuns are not a unified, cohesive political force. They are subject to tribal and regional differences, with a growing number of young, educated youth, including women, who are not willing to go back to a regressive Islamic code of the earlier Taliban rule. The flourishing illicit drug economy has its own compulsions and imperatives. It encourages regional autonomy, local stability, and absence of disruptive warfare. Major Hawala transactions involving the Gulf states will be a crucial factor. The focus of the de facto partition effort would be on defending the northern and western regions, containing roughly 60% of the Afghan population. These areas are, and they include Kabul and the cities in the north and west, which are not Pashtun dominated and are not sympathetic to the Pashtun Taliban. The partnership and collaboration of Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras, Iranians, and supportive Pashtun would be vital and effective in this endeavor. Al-Qaeda bases and their Taliban supporters would be the targets within Afghanistan, and Afghan Taliban encroachments across the de facto partition lines and terrorist sanctuaries in and along the Pakistan border. Central Asian states, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, Russian Federation, and even possibly China could lend support to contain Islamic extremist ideology and terrorism. Select Gulf countries who have been active interlocutors could also look to encourage a more stable and predictable evolution in Afghanistan and the region. It is more than likely that the Taliban would resort to violence to assert their ideology and rule in the south, and there would be intense combat, violence, and carnage. Pashtuns and Taliban in Afghanistan may become a center of international terrorism, along with the current epicenter in Pakistan. A severe Islamic code would be imposed, affecting the daily lives of the people, especially women and civil society. De facto balkanization of Afghanistan could, over time, be the result.
Thank you. Bye.
The people of Afghanistan will unfortunately pay the price. And I can stop there. I have a bit on the illicit drug economy, but I can come back to that later, time permit. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Mandy?
Yeah, Swash, that was great. Thank you. Kind of transported us back to college a little bit, but that's great. And we hope to get a little action on the discussion very soon. But let me bring in at this point Rakesh Sood, who has actually been on one of our monthly lectures only in August with Amber Sen. Some of you will remember on a tete-a-tete around Afghanistan. So let me reintroduce him. He's a former Indian diplomat who finished his college, by the way, doing an MSc in physics in 74. And he's a diplomat, a columnist, a writer, and many of us see him on many television channels quite often. He served as India's ambassador to Afghanistan, Nepal, France, and the permanent rep at the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva. amongst his other assignments abroad, he's also served in the embassies at Islamabad, Brussels, Dakar, and Washington, D.C. Now, whilst he was at the Ministry of External Affairs, he was also Joint Secretary heading the Disarmament and International Security Affairs Division. So I guess it's little wonder then he was appointed by the PM Manmohan Singh as a special envoy for the disarmament and non-proliferation in September 2013. Now, he's a distinguished fellow of the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. And as I read, he is a member of the Asia Pacific Leadership for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, which in short is APLN. And I was just thinking, Rakesh, if you inserted an A, it could well be APLAN, which is a plan. So that is something you might hold for us at some point. But over to you. You're a guru on Afghanistan. So please give us your opening comments for the next 6-7 minutes. Thanks. Over to you, Rakesh.
Thanks, Mandy. I was waiting for the pun. But now this is a bit tricky because, as you said, I just spoke less than a month ago, and I guess there are many people who probably heard me at that time. So
well,
I apologize if there are some who will feel that I'm being a little repetitive.
No, Rakesh, since you asked for it, I was hoping this would still suit you to talk once again within a month. But anyway, over to you.
Well, enough has happened within a month, Mandy, in Afghanistan. We can speak every week on Afghanistan. Lots is happening. So anyway, I think Swash gave a wonderful introduction. And it reminds me of, there is an old saying about Afghanistan. It is somewhat apocryphal in the sense that there was some old sage who told the Pashtuns, because Pashtuns constitute largely the bulk of Afghan population, about 42%. And traditionally, they have also ruled Afghanistan from the time that Ahmad Shah Abdali created what is modern Afghanistan, as Swash reminded us, in the mid-18th century. He said, the sage was happy about something and also a little upset about something that the fellows did. So he said, there is a boon and there is a curse. And he said, you will always be free and you will never be united. So in a sense, a lot of what Swash subsequently related to us is a bit of that. But then, all these sayings, apocryphal, etc., they all contain an element of a myth in it. I mean, one of the biggest myths that you hear about Afghanistan, graveyard of empires. To me, that's actually a pretty, it's a kind of a myth that has achieved currency, because frankly, the first empire that they talk about is the British Empire, British Indian Empire. Now, the fact is that nobody really wanted that territory. That territory of Afghanistan between the Persian Empire, between the British Indian Empire, between the Tsarist Empire was always a buffer state. It was always a frontier area. It was not really a territory that people coveted to occupy. It was a territory that that empires wanted to ensure that their enemy should not take control over it. So, which is where this notion of a buffer, which is a strange kind of a thing, but it is very relevant for empires, because empires create they have boundaries, and then they have lines, and then they have frontiers, and they have spheres of influence. I mean, that's how empires have traditionally operated. And so in that sense, it is a little bit, and even when the British had, they had 3 Anglo-Afghan wars, and but each time they would sort of teach the Afghans a lesson, come back and appoint a political agent. And then the Afghans would get restive. They would kill off that political agent. There would be an uprising and the British would go back again and pacify them and then come back. The same, I mean, the second empire people talk about is the Soviet Empire. But the Soviet Empire was defeated because you had another superpower, which was arming the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen had sanctuary in Pakistan. I mean, the Soviets essentially realized that they could not walk across the Durand line to tackle the Mujahideen. And that is why in 1985 itself, the moment Gorbachev came power, it was decided that this was a bleeding wound and that they would walk away from it. The same problem afflicted the US. I mean, the US never had the willingness to go across the Durand line. I mean, every American general who has served there for the last 12, 13 years has said that you can't win an insurgency that enjoys safe havens and sanctuaries. Every single US general has said that. I mean, Hillary Clinton very famously said, those who keep snakes in the backyard cannot expect that the snakes will only bite the neighbor. I mean, Joint Chiefs of Staff Admiral Mike Millen said in somewhere 2012 or 13, the ISI is a veritable arm, the Haqqani network is a veritable arm of the ISI. I mean, these are all public statements. So it is not as if Pakistan's role was a secret. It is just that there was an inability to be able to tackle that role. And so therefore, in any insurgency, what happens is that a status quo always suits the insurgent. I mean, Ho Chi Minh famously told the Americans, he said, you will kill 10 people, I will kill one person. And eventually you will lose your moral strength and you will leave. And so in that sense, that is what happened. Another myth that got created was Joe Biden's forever wars, blood and treasure and all the rest of it. In economics, there is this fallacy of sunk cost. So it was a little bit like that. If you think about it, the US had ended its war at the end of 2014. Between 1st January 2015 and to date, the US has lost a total of 67 service persons killed in action in Afghanistan. 67 in 6.5 years. This year's budget was 14 billion. Last year's was about 33 billion, their defense budget, the allocation for Afghanistan. I mean, given the fact that their annual defense budget is about 700 billion plus, I mean, this is a tiny amount. But because it got projected as a forever war that had to be ended, it became a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You needed to get out. And so once again, you have these kind of myths about, as I said, whether it is the forever war or whether it is another myth that got created that the Afghans don't fight or the Afghan army didn't want to fight. Well, in these 6.5 years that the Americans lost about 67 people killed in action, the Afghans lost more than 50,000.
Right, yeah.
They were doing the fighting. So it's not as if there were these differences. So I think what happens with these narratives is that,
maybe the last 1 minute, Rakesh.
yes, sir.
Yeah.
So what happens with these myths is that they end up creating narratives and which tend to color our, understanding and perception. And I think this is where the tragedy of Afghanistan, in a sense, lies, because for too long, this kind of historical narrative about Afghanistan has been caught up in a lot of myth making. I think in the Q&A, perhaps we'll come around to be more on the India's options, if it has any. Thank you.
Thanks, Rakesh. That was wonderful. And I might, just add in quickly, since you were missing some puns. I said you might have become quite the soothsayer now on Afghanistan. But anyway, let me now move on to our friend Gautam Mukhopadhyay, who was closer to me in college years. And he finished his BA in history in 1976. And he joined the Foreign Service. And he's been in the embassies in Mexico, in France, in Cuba, Afghanistan, and Myanmar, and the permanent mission of India in New York. Interestingly, he opened the Indian embassy in Kabul in 2001 as the charge d'affaires after the ouster of the Taliban in Afghanistan, and then returned there as India's ambassador to Afghanistan from July 2010 to May 2013. He's also the alumnus of the NDC and a visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. And interestingly, he's also, has a wide range of interests ranging from Indian classical music to jazz, rock, travel, and as he writes, tropical trees and literature. So there's an eclectic mix for you. And what I love about his other sort of peregrinations are he did a travel of 4 months actually in 1977 from Afghanistan to Europe and back. You know, in the good old days when you used to have the route open from Delhi to sort of London and back. So that must have been exciting. And he's also been around the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra, a motorboat trip down the Mekong, and he is currently a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research. So over to you, Mukho, your first 7 minutes comment, please. You're on mute, so, okay. Gautam, Mukho, you're on mute, please.
Yeah, okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Mandy. Thank you, Pittu, for inviting me and for organizing this excellent event. And I see, really a galaxy of people from my time who I can very much recognize here. I see Nainan, Dr. Qureshi, Vivek Bharti, Anup Thakur. This is just on this first page. I'm sure there are many others. And it's really particularly nice to see Shwashpavan Singh. Mandy, you mentioned about our trip to Afghanistan. In fact, Shwashpavan was second secretary, and there were 3 of us from St. Stephen's College who traveled through Afghanistan on that trip. One of them was Nikhil Seth, who's currently in the UN still, and joined the Foreign Service with me. Incidentally, we were also both born the same day and same time. So, there are many associations. I should also mention that there are at least 3 other Stephanians who have been intimately associated with Afghanistan. Jayant Prasad, who unfortunately is missing today, but also Arun Singh and Yash Sinha. So, the sort of Stevens fraternity in Afghanistan is quite strong. Okay, now I have managed to waste 1 minute. So in the remaining 5 minutes, let me sort of address the questions that we have. I'd like to thank Swashpavan for his very comprehensive introduction, and Rakesh for actually, so to say, puncturing some myths about Afghanistan. I would just like to begin by saying, that there are a range of scenarios still available to us. Still yesterday, we were thinking of a good case scenario where the Afghan Taliban would actually consider an inclusive government. I never believed that they would actually have an inclusive government, but clearly that is off. What we have today is very much a kind of jihadi cabinet, ultra-conservative as well as highly militant, that will be focused both domestically as well as externally, because they're extremely enmeshed and intertwined with a whole range of jihadi outfits relating to Central Asia, Iran, India, and also the Shias and other minorities. So, and in addition to that, of course, they are intertwined with the Al-Qaeda. The ISIS has a presence. Part of it is linked, part of it may be independent. But either way, we have a snake pit of extremist, radical, and terrorist organizations. And the umbrella of the emirate actually allows all of them to operate, because it creates a kind of blurred boundary within which they can operate. Now, I'll just quickly turn to the options that are available. Given the fact that now we have pretty certainly, as I called it, a kind of war cabinet or a jihadi cabinet. I think we can begin from the softer to the harder options that we have, particularly because it's often considered that, we don't have very many options. We are powerless. There is little that we can do. So we have to kind of accept the reality. And the reality is that we have to swallow, swallow our whatever gains we made in the last 20 years and take a backseat to Pakistan, China, Iran, Russia, and the others. I actually think that that's a bit of a resigned and somewhat defeatist attitude. Immediately, I think one of the things that we can do, even though it poses certain challenges in terms of to what degree we might legitimize the Taliban, is simply, put out a kind of humanitarian assistance program. There are various ways that we can do this without actually legitimizing the Taliban government. Of course, a certain amount of permissiveness from the Taliban side, not just to us, but to the world at large, would be required. For example, we could have a much more liberal visa policy, which would allow all those, a lot of the thousands of Afghans who want to leave to at least come to India for temporary shelter. We are not talking about refugees, which would, get caught in the whole issue of CAA and so on. We are talking about temporary visas, temporary residence, perhaps even transit visas to be able to go to other places. We can open India, continue to keep India open to students, scholarships for Afghan students, which has been probably one of the biggest pillars of our support to Afghanistan. We can continue to be open to the medical patients from Afghanistan, and up the ladder, we can provide space and room for relocation of media organizations, think tanks, scholars, cultural personalities, people who really are the repository of Afghan cultural identity who are likely to be persecuted. And in this case, I'd just like to mention, in slight distinction to something that Shrash said, that I think the Pakistani Taliban project was in fact a project to erase Afghan and Pashtun identity so that the Pashtun problem would be to some extent diluted or dissolved or even externalized, and actually submerge Afghan identity into a larger pan-Islamic identity, which would also allow them to be able to radicalize the Tajik, Uzbeks, and the others. Of course, the minority Shias would remain a problem. And even today, in the governing council, there is no scheme. In Iran, you have a largely Shia country, but in Afghanistan, you have a very large number of Shias. And a governing council composed of Sunni clerics will find it very difficult to accommodate Shias. But further up, I think the most important thing is that India should be able to keep the alternative of an emirate, the alternative of a repressive, backward, ultra-conservative emirate, and on the side of democracy, a republic, like you can call it an Islamic republic. But what is common to them all is the whole idea of freedom and the whole idea of an identity of Afghan people. And this actually you can do just by simply hosting all the categories of people that I mentioned, from the media to the intellectuals to the cultural personalities. And of course, people who are persecuted, civil society activists, women, political activists, even political figures. Presently, there is only one major political figure who has taken refuge in India. Most of the others have gone to Turkey or to the West or to the United States. In fact, we should have a much more receptive policy towards political figures, because that is what is actually going to give us leverage in Afghanistan in the future. And finally, we should not close the options of supporting the resistance. The resistance represents the entire Afghan people. The Taliban have no organic presence in Afghanistan. There have been Islamist parties in the past. There are Islamist parties in Afghanistan today, the Jamiyat, the Hizb-e-Islami, Sayyaf's party, several others. But there has been no Taliban political entity in Afghanistan so far. And it is an alien ideology. It's basically a Pakistani project with an Afghan face, Pakistani brains, and Pakistani hands behind it. And they have masterminded what is a 20-year project to invade and occupy Afghanistan, waiting and enabling the departure of US forces, using terrorism as a war of attrition to completely wear down the Afghan people from any form of resistance. And of course, I think a lot of other countries, including the United States, have been complicit in actually creating an Afghan state that was deliberately kept weak, an Afghan army that was extremely limited and weak, and an Afghan government that was corrupted by the gravy train of US money, US money that was spent, but very little investment. No investment in the economy, no investment in trade, no investment in the mineral wealth, no investment in democracy outside backroom deals, no investment in the army, because the army itself was limited to a counter-terrorism special force kind of units, which numbered probably less than the Taliban, but which had to actually prosecute the last stages of the war without mobility, without air support, which had been totally dependent on the Americans, and without technical support for their armaments. So I think support for the resistance, because support for the resistance is support for freedom of the Afghan people. And I would go to the extent of saying that at some stage we should be prepared to host an Afghan government in exile, consisting of all the people who stand for democracy, who stand for freedom, who stand for rights, human rights, as well as women rights and minority rights. And I think we could be active in trying to bring the diaspora of Afghans who are now sprinkled and probably have very little common platform to be able to exercise the kind of political levers in Afghanistan and the region. If we try to just follow the rest of the world in kind of legitimizing and accepting the fate of Afghanistan, then of course we will be just a part of the sheep following, in a herd. But if we want to, we can, and we have the ability to be able to chart out our own independent policy, which can make a difference to Afghanistan, as well as establish our credentials as a major power in the region. There's a lot else that could be said, but I think I've crossed my time limit. So thank you. I was open to questions. A very interesting point made by Swash about partition. This is something that I think we could come back to in the Q&A.
Thank you, Mukho. That was some very, very interesting thoughts indeed. And I think maybe it's a bit like, it's been remarked earlier about the great game sort of shifting and continuing, but in a much more chilling fashion because we are witnessing it. So maybe with this round of the initial comments by the panelists, can I hand over to Pitu, who can take it forward with some pointed questions and get the panel discussion going? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mandy. And it is wonderful really to hear three experts giving such deep knowledge of the region and sharing with us their views. Thank you very much, all three of you, Swash, Mukho and Rakesh. Thank you for this wonderful introduction. May I now bring you back to the initial talk that we were trying to focus on, that is implications for India. That is what I would like you to focus on. And here I will quote from our own batchmate and fellow Stephanian, Pawan Verma, who's written a recent article, I'm sure you've seen it, where he says, do not recognize the Taliban. Do not give them legitimacy. So here is my question to all three of you. As Indian diplomats, should we really be looking at connecting with this Taliban in some manner or connecting with Afghanistan in some manner? Thank you. The floor is open to all three of you. Swash.
Swash, you need to unmute. Swash, yeah. Sorry, Swash, you're still on mute. Oh, yeah.
I think let's go to Rakesh or to Mukho.
Maybe Rakesh can take it on before we get to Mukho.
Yeah, Rakesh.
Oh, yeah.
See, I think the host has to unmute us.
No, you're unmuted now. Now you're unmuted.
Now I'm unmuted, yeah. But when I was trying to unmute myself earlier, it said that I can't unmute myself unless the host unmutes me.
Oh,
So,
I see. Sorry.
The host has overall control.
The ghost always has overall control.
Like Pakistan over Taliban.
Yeah, that's right.
Mandy, you shut us up.
No.
To answer your question, Pitu, I don't think we are in a position to take the lead on any recognition business. You see, essentially, we have, to a great extent, marginalized ourselves over a period of time from the fact that because while we enjoyed enormous popularity, we were considered the most preferred development partner and all the rest of it. But in recent years, we kind of politically disengaged, as it were. And so to that extent, we put all our eggs in one basket, basically two eggs. One egg was the Ashraf Ghani government. I mean, we knew that it wasn't a popular government. The second thing was, it wasn't a government that was supported by the vast majority of Afghans. And the second egg was the US military presence. Now, neither exists anymore. And so, in a sense, we got somewhat marginalized in the process. Now, the international community essentially has three sets of leverages. One is the diplomatic recognition, as you said, to the Taliban regime. And obviously, that is going to be driven much more by the big boys, permanent members of the Security Council and so on. If you notice, even the countries that have kept their embassies going, including Pakistan, including Russia, including China, including Iran, none of them has gone and given recognition. In fact, Pakistani statements are very wishy-washy on that count. So that's one. The second leverage that the international community has is that there are a number of these Taliban fellows who are on the UN Security Council sanctions list, which bars their travel and all the rest of it. I mean, we've heard various reports, we've seen various reports saying that out of the 33 appointments that were announced, as many as 14 or 17 of those are on the sanctions list, including the Prime Minister, the Rais-e-Jamhuri. So that's the other thing. So you have that, the international community has that leverage. And the third leverage is essentially the American leverage. It is exclusively American because the Afghan central bank has large amounts of reserves, about $9 billion. A large part of that, about 8 billion or whatever, is controlled by the US because it is lying in terms of US treasuries and so on. The balance is with the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland. And I doubt very much if they're going to take an independent view, independent of the US, let's say. So in that sense, you have a situation where the Afghans are a little bit strapped in terms of cash. I mean, we've seen reports that ATMs have run out of money. People can't get money from ATMs. So they're kind of scrambling around to kind of see how so that is the third leverage. Now, to the extent that this leverage is used, what will this get used for is the question. And none of these three leverages are leverages that we can exercise. We can perhaps exercise a little bit of leverage because we currently chair the UN Sanctions Committee. And which doesn't mean that, but that's, there are 15 countries. But it means only that perhaps we can delay a meeting. You don't convene a meeting as the chair. You kind of say, all right now, I'm too busy. I mean, you'll do it 2 weeks later. I mean, we've all done this kind of thing. So, but other than that, the leverage is really with the big boys.
Okay, got it. Thanks, Rakesh. Swash, would you like to come in here? Swash?
Yeah, just one quick point. I think it's too early in the game to even start thinking about any kind of recognition. The regime in power has still to consolidate. As Rakesh said, you have serious economic issues, serious issues of support within the system. We don't know how the neighboring countries are going to respond. The Taliban represent a very small minority, even amongst the Pashtuns. And therefore, I think we should postpone thinking about this down the line. We should work with many others who have a similar concern about what Taliban is trying to do in terms of their value system and what they're trying to do in terms of their economic system. And when the time comes, yes, we'll consider recognition. Otherwise, no question of giving them legitimacy.
Thanks, Swash. Mukho, your views?
Yeah, thank you. Let me also acknowledge, some that Yash is here, and I see also Sanjay Acharya, really throwback to many, many years. Good to see you, Sanjay. To answer your question very directly, I think we should be the last country, if at all, to recognize Taliban. the Taliban government. And even I think we should be extremely hesitant to grant any kind of legitimacy. As Priyanka has observed, we were the only country that did not cut a deal behind the backs of the Afghan government and people in the run-up to this. And it would be a pity if we actually let them down after they have virtually occupied and are actually conducting a virtual genocide in some parts of Afghanistan and again some sections of Afghanistan. So I would say that if I had to come down black and white, I would say no legitimization, no recognition. But I will also say that there are certain compulsions that we have that require a kind of minimal engagement, and that engagement should be directed towards the people, not the government. There are two conditions that must be met. One is that genuinely they have to move towards an inclusive government, which is acceptable to the Afghan people. This is not going to happen. So I think that is academic now. The second is, I think, whatever assurances they may give in terms of our individual bilateral security interests and concerns is not worth the paper that it's on. Because even if one faction were to be able to give you, let's say, a simple thing like security of your embassy, the Haqqani network could not control an attack in the Kabul airport, either by collusion or they were simply incapable of doing it from the IS. So, the ISI continues to back its pet horses, and it will definitely it will definitely subvert or sabotage whichever such faction it wants to cooperate with us, and in fact conduct its operations through someone else. And there is no guarantee that any party can give that they can prevent it, because that is the kind of hold of the ISI on the Taliban. But
Thanks.
The minimal engagement, sorry, just one point. The minimal engagement part is important because the whole game, the whole China-Pakistan game in this is to orient or reorient Afghanistan towards Central Asia and China and sever its historical, traditional, trade, cultural, political, and other ties with India. And therefore, we must keep the P2P window open. We must even be able to have flights. We should continue with our trade engagement because that is the one thing that gives us leverage in Afghanistan, and all the other things that I mentioned, education, medical treatment, and the rest of it. So a space for minimal engagement, short of legitimization, and definitely not recognition, unless the two other preconditions are fulfilled.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Mukho. Now we're going to be opening up this whole thing to the whole debate and to all the participants. We have so many of them here today, almost about 100. But before I do that, may I just make a small request or a small question actually on behalf of Ranu Das. Ranu Das is one of our members of the SKT, and he very much wanted to be here but couldn't because he's traveling. But he sent a question in advance, and that was really addressed to all three of you major foreign diplomats. Basically, he's asking a very pertinent question. He says, 5 years ago, India said we are going to become one of the permanent members of the UN. Today, we are nobody in the region. We are not even with our neighbors anybody. So have we really failed in diplomatic policy? And he goes on to talk about Afghanistan. And he says we have no real alliance partners, either with Russia or with Iran or with China. And we are really out in the dark on our own. Is it really something which we should be looking at? Should we, as foreign diplomats, be saying that our policies have been very well done and therefore we should continue with these policies, or how do you look at it? Open to all three of you. Thank you. Swash, the senior most.
I'll pass on this because I think it's a question which has a much wider ambit and doesn't apply to the subject we're in.
Okay.
I'll pass it on to my more competent colleagues.
Okay, thanks. Mukho?
Well, I was hoping that you would actually pass it on to Rakesh because he's the expert in these global and matters and so on. But let me give an answer. Look, I think what we have done in Afghanistan within the kind of limited window that we had in 2001, in terms of basically soft power, development projects, scholarships, culture, and etc., has been quite good. We've expanded our constituency of goodwill. We are easily have been the most popular country in the world in Afghanistan, but we have failed short in some things that Rakesh alluded to. One is that we failed to convert this goodwill into actually political power, political leverage, and serious political partnerships. And actually, we run the greater risk today of even using that goodwill to not have a more liberal visa policy at a time when people are fleeing from Afghanistan for the sake of their life, for life and death issues and for freedom and rights issues. Having done so much and gained so much, to just close the tap at this point of time is going to cost us extremely heavily. There is a tendency in certain quarters in India to start looking at Afghans and Afghanistan from a kind of Islamic prism. That would be a mistake, because the prism with which they are approaching us is the prism of freedom, democracy, rights, and liberties. And they see India and pluralism. And they see India, regardless of whatever we think about India or not, as a kind of working pluralist democracy still. So I think that's a very important component. The second, in terms of partnerships, it is true that in the present state, there's a complete inversion of the old partnerships of democratic Afghanistan, India, United States, democratic West, and democratic Asia, in favor of, the alternative, which is Taliban, Pakistan, China, Iran, Russia. But, just as the Americans will discover that the Taliban cannot take care of the Al-Qaeda problem, the Russians will discover that the Taliban cannot take care of the IS and IMU and Hizb ut-Tahrir problem, and the Iranians will discover that they cannot take care of their Shia and Jundullah problem in Sistan, Baluchistan. And sooner or later, and in fact, we've already seen signs in the recent visits of, both the US CIA director, the National Security Advisor of Afghanistan, of Russia, as well as in some overtures we have seen in the past from Iran, that that kind of rethinking, or at least Plan B, is already at work. So I don't think, again,
Thanks, Mukho. Thank you very much. Yeah, let's hear Rakesh. Rakesh, your views.
Well, the question essentially, veers around to, as Mukho said, I mean, it comes around to a lot of our domestic politics and the perceptions around domestic politics. The visa policy, I mean, it's a fact. What happened was that we used to issue about 300 to 400 visas every day. Well, that's a normal working day kind of a thing. I assume that we were in the run-up to when we closed our embassy during those troubled periods, perhaps we were issuing a little more, maybe about 600 a day. I mean, I honestly don't know, but 300-400 a day was the average that was there. Now, we announced that none of these visas are valid any longer. So they've been cancelled. People who had those visas can't use them. We announced that we are setting out an e-visa, emergency e-visa policy. The fact is that in that emergency e-visa policy, we've issued a total of, as far as newspapers indicate, something like about 40 e-visas today. So these are people who have been friends of India. And we've seen pictures, of course, of the Afghan Hindus and Afghan Sikhs who have come back on a couple of these evacuation flights, about 112 of them, according to the statement made by External Affairs Minister in Parliament. But we haven't seen, any more people who, as Mukho said, it's not as if a lot of people want to come here, but they probably want to come here in a way of getting to other places if they can. And to that extent, however, the other point is that we have no evacuation flights, we have no presence left in Kabul. So to that extent, even if we have to do people to people, or if we have to do trade eventually, or whatever it is, it will still have to depend on the government, the nature of the government being what it is. Whether they will permit us to have this people-to-people contact, whether they will permit us, if there are no direct flights, for example, between India and Afghanistan, I mean, you can keep issuing visas, but it becomes that much more difficult for people to travel.
Thanks, Rakesh. You're basically fudging it off by saying that it's a part of the domestic environment.
It is, because as Mukho said very clearly, the domestic environment is that the domestic environment treats Muslims, all Muslims, as Taliban. And so therefore,
got it. Let's not get into that angle.
I don't want to get into another debate in this.
Yeah, let's not get into that debate. Let me now go to the chat box. There are some interesting questions in the chat box, and I'll go with the first one from Mayank Mishra. And this is to Swash Pawan Singh. He says, de facto partition is a great idea between the Islamic Emirates and Islamic Republic. What do you think of Swash?
as a concept, it's very good. How do you actually make it happen on the ground? It'll have to be done by the Afghans themselves. If the present Taliban government does not become inclusive, does not reach out to other people, there will be turmoil within the country. And we noticed the last time around there was a Northern Alliance and there was a division. I think that's the direction in which it's going if the present policies of the Taliban government continue. If that should happen, then the possibilities are there. Second, I think we give too much credit to Pakistan to say that they have such total control over everything in Afghanistan because the ISI has, one faction or the other faction. Pakistan has serious internal problems of their own. There is going to be a backward movement within their areas in Balochistan and in the Pashtun areas. I think what we should be concerned about longer term is what is going to be the implication of a Taliban regime which alienates all kinds of people within Pakistan. And that's going to be a much bigger problem for us than what's happening in Afghanistan just now. I don't buy into this thing that Pakistanis are in such total control. They're not. They are in fact more vulnerable now than they have been in the past for this reason.
Okay, got it. Thanks, Vash. We have another question here from Vivek, and let me direct this to Mukho, please. What are the factions within the Taliban, and can we control or leverage some of them in partnership with other regional powers like Iran and Russia and even the West, and use those factions of Taliban which support a more democratic environment? Mukho?
Yeah. As the Taliban begin their rule and differences appear amongst themselves and between them and the Pakistanis, it's possible that we may be able to play some of them. But, let me I think this is kind of a little exaggerated, the capacity to play this. Mullah Baradar was in Pakistani jails for 8 years. He was caught in a sting operation simply because he tried to establish contacts, or the Afghan government tried to establish contacts with him, and he responded. In jail, he was practically broken physically and psychologically. He was only revived when he was useful for the US Taliban direct talks by Pakistan. The fact is that in spite of this mistreatment for 8 years, there's not been a whimper or a squeak from the Taliban about the treatment of Baradar by ISI in Pakistan. Similarly, Mullah Umar was dead for 2 years. Nobody has ever in the Taliban squeaked about what happened, why he died, why his death was kept secret. And they managed to control it that well that it was not leaked. And the same with Mullah Haibatullah. We have got used to dealing with the Taliban in terms of shadow governments, in terms of spokespersons, and in terms of deputy leaders. We do not know who's actually masterminding and controlling the strings of the puppets. Even Haibatullah is just basically recognized by one photograph. You do not know what he has said. So the fact is that we are dealing with a very shadow outfit. And why privately, many of them complain about the Pakistanis and ISI, and I have innumerable expressions of that, which are not parliamentary enough to use here. The fact is that they have not done anything. They have never, ever taken an action that is anti-Pakistan. So I will go by actions rather than, and the main factions are very clear. One is the Haqqani network, which is, as Rakesh said, or Swash said, a veritable arm of the ISI. The second is what we generally call the, Mullah Yaqub or the Kandahari, Loya Kandahar kind of, a group, which is essentially people who came under Mullah Umar. A lot of the current cabinet includes Kandaharis and so on. And then you have, some other elements like what, again, there are some sort of complications, individual complications. Mullah Yaqub is there, the Haqqanis are there. There are some others who have been actually excluded in the process. Even the political wing of Mullah Baradar and let's say the foreign wing of Stanikzai, they have been given a lower position than expected in the current regime. So I think these are the three broad factions: the political commission, the military commission, and the Haqqani network. But right now, they are not yet fighting amongst themselves or with the Pakistanis. When that happens, then we will see.
Okay, thanks, Gautu. Rakesh, here's something coming up. Yeah, Amrita Chima is also there. And let's see if he asks anybody anything. Anyway, here's a question from Sunil Chopra from London, who's saying, what is the likely outcome of recent meetings with the CIA and the Russian NSA? Of course, tomorrow's newspaper will carry it, but still, Rakesh, would you like to comment on this? outcome of CIA and Russian connections with India? Yeah. Rakesh,
Yeah, okay. Now,
yeah, thanks.
well, I think the CIA chief coming here is very simple. I believe that there are obviously concerns. We are, as I mentioned earlier, we are in the Security Council. The US would like to exercise a certain leverage. They would like to ensure that we are on the same page. You know, on 31st of August, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution on Afghanistan. Two countries abstained, namely Russia and China. Okay, so you can understand that as part of it. There could also be another reason, namely that the Americans, as you know, have taken a lot of Afghans, but they're not necessarily all the Afghans are in US. I mean, many of them are in transit areas. And right now they are also negotiating very hard and exercising their leverage to get out more Afghans, their friends, as well as about 200 odd American citizens and perhaps other allies and so on. They need a place to park them while they process their applications. I would not be surprised if they want to use their friendship with us to persuade us to park them somewhere in a transit camp or in a transit facility or something like that. I think some media reports have hinted at something like that. Why did the Russian come here? The Russians realize, exactly as Mukho said, that it is not, you know, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, their principal objective was to get the Americans out. Now, Biden has basically told them, okay, buddy, I'm out. This is your shit. It's in your backyard. Manage it. So the Russians and the Iranians and others are kind of scrambling a little bit. We've already seen one statement out of Iran. You know, Iran got pretty cheesed off when with these reports that at Panjshir, there were reports of drones being operated by Pakistanis or things like that. And the Iranian came out publicly with a statement condemning the presence of foreign forces. And this time by foreign, they did not mean American. They meant Pakistani. And they said, this has to be investigated and we will undertake an investigation. So, you know, you see that kind of a thing happening. The Russians are also concerned that if the Taliban are unable to distance themselves from the various groups that threaten the Central Asian countries, then what happens? And so therefore they are now reaching out, even though in the past when they were doing their own outreach, you know, we were at a bit of a distance. So I think it is the natural order, how long the natural order takes. I mean, Swash has talked about it, Mukho has talked about it. Essentially, Pakistan has always tried to work on a Pashtun Islamist model. But sooner or later, what happens is that when the Afghan gets into his own country, he starts adopting a nationalist Pashtun hat, as it were. He starts wearing that. Now, that nationalist Pashtun hat causes inconvenience to the Pakistanis who prefer to use the Islamist hat, because that way they think they can make them work together to fight India or to fight a foreign occupying force or whatever it is. So that is where the tension comes in. Others, we have traditionally always felt more comfortable with the nationalist Pashtun, not with the Islamist Pashtun. The Taliban have always been an Islamist entity. Pashtun, yes, but an Islamist Pashtun entity, fighting on the basis of undertaking jihad and so on.
Thanks, Rakesh. Go, Mukho, here's a question to you from Yashina. I'm sure you already read the question, but basically he's talking about developing an air base with a strategic asset for India. Any comments on that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Yash. You know, as I said, you know, we have many levers. I didn't mention about any, but for example, in 1996, 2001, we had a field hospital in Farkhar, just across the border. It's very clear that Tajikistan is extremely upset and alienated by the Taliban, particularly because they are targeting the Tajiks. because the Tajiks have been resisting them, have been in the forefront of the resistance. So it's very likely that Tajikistan will be on pretty much the same page with us, except that Tajikistan is not always able to act independently because of the Russian bear behind them. So we have to wait for the Russians also to get a little cooperative. But the very fact that we have, I won't say we have an air base. We have a detachment, or we have a presence in an air base. The very fact that we have that, is something that will keep Pakistan thinking over their shoulder. And, so let me make also a larger point. All those who say that we are helpless and can't do anything are effectively giving Afghanistan to Pakistan for strategic depth. And instead of that, giving that strategic depth, actually Afghanistan can be a strategic asset for us, behind Pakistan. For 70 years, the Pakistanis have been fearing it and even been exaggerating it. But the reality is that we have never ever used that. And I think this is a very big kind of lever that we have to keep Pakistan guessing. So any would definitely be part of that kind of instrumentality. So I think on that particular question, that's my answer. But there are probably a few other points that I might have liked to address if there is time.
Okay, let's get to what Priyanka Bhardwaj is asking. She's talking, and this is to Swash. Basically, she's talking about General Bismillah Muhammad having just tweeted the Tajiks are seriously considering dividing the Tajik-dominated northern Afghanistan territory into a separate state. What are your comments, sir? Swash.
This has been coming up from time to time. Amir Shah Massoud's son had made a public statement some time ago when he had visited Europe that there is no other option except you have to divide the country. Many other people have written. But a lot of this is theory just now. On the ground, we still have to see what the Taliban is capable of doing. My belief is that the average Afghan is not an Islamicist. His primary unit of identity is first his family, then his sub-tribe, then his tribe. And Islam is always there. He is not a Taliban supporter. We can see what happened in the last 20 years. The whole generation has grown up. Afghanistan has modernized. I was there in the 70s. It's a long time ago, but it was a different Afghanistan. Everybody went to college. Everybody spoke. Women wore skirts. We went to dance parties. There was music. Afghanistan is an old, ancient civilization. Any civilization or country that can weave the kind of carpets that Afghan people in Afghanistan weave. They ran a water supply system called the Kanat, which was an underground system. They created it. Look at the mosques they've created. The Afghans are evolved, culturally sensitive people. They have music. They dance. They atan. They play the buzkashi. Let's not stereotype them and make them into Islamic or non-Islamic. The average Afghan is an Afghan first. And Islam is part of him. He is not a bigoted person like the Taliban. So therefore, my sense is an Afghan will not accept this kind of reduction of the Afghan identity. Now, coming back to Tajikistan, yes, the Tajiks have a reason. It happened in the past. There is a strong possibility of this happening, but it requires many other things to happen. It raises one other question. With the Americans moving out as it did after 2014, basically, was it an act of omission or was it an act of commission? I think Mukho has in some of his writings indicated that we still have to see whether this was deliberately done, as I said, for all these fellows to come in there and discover for themselves what it means to get bogged down in a very difficult situation. So I think part answer would be the Tajiks, the Uzbeks. 60% of the population is not Pashtun. And even amongst the Pashtuns, the majority are not with the Taliban version. And therefore, let's look at Afghanistan more holistically. And I'm again saying we give Pakistan too much credit. Pakistan is not capable of doing the kind of thing that we are giving them so much credit for.
Thanks, Swash. Here's an interesting one, and Mukho, probably you can try and answer this one. Basically saying that shouldn't we open India to all women from Afghanistan, women and young girls under the age of 40? Let them all come into India and become a big haven for women from Afghanistan in India.
No, I think I think it is Rudra Chaudhary, if I'm not wrong, who's made that
Yes.
observation. I think, I think we should be generally liberal, and women are among the most likely to be, most persecuted. Their opportunities will be completely crushed and suffocated. So they should definitely be a priority category. But if we go around announcing something like this specifically for girls and women, already women are being made into the battleground for so to say foreign influence and the authentic Taliban kind of view, their view of what is an authentic Afghan kind of Islamic tradition, or not even an Afghan tradition, I would say an Islamic tradition. So I don't think we should burden women too much with the whole issue of freedom. Freedom applies to everyone, and women as a particularly persecuted community, we should be much more receptive. But under conditions of security, they would like to come with their families and so on. So I think we should be permissive. But as I said, not to the exclusion of many other groups, because there are many other groups also who are persecuted. There are many other groups who are, give you political leverage. And of course, humanitarian issues do play a role. Education does play a role. So I think all that. May I just actually take the opportunity to answer a couple of questions that have been sort of
Sure, Muko. Go ahead.
Around.
Go ahead.
Very, very quickly, about the CIA. It was nice of Swash to mention, about my theory about why the US withdrew and why they in many ways enabled. Sorry, a phone coming. Why they have enabled actually the Taliban to come. If you see the US-Taliban deal, it is completely stacked in favor of the Taliban. So in my view, it is not just that they have decided to withdraw and let the countries handle. They have actually set the Taliban onto the region with the primary intention of destabilizing, most of all China, but also Russia, and keeping the Iranians off balance. And one possible reason for the CIA director's visit could be that he's out to see if there is a commonality of interest between India and the United States on that. And a kind of intelligence war. They started off with the CT war, counter-terrorists, then went to COIN, then went to training and equipment. And the fourth stage is actually an intelligence war. And it's quite possible that, and there'll be people in India who will be tempted, but that will be a big mistake because, the US can treat Afghanistan as collateral, but we should not treat Afghanistan as collateral. We should treat Afghanistan as strategic for us. And that means that, instability in Afghanistan is also going to bite us. And strategic depth, and the strategic depth that you will give Pakistan is also going to bite us. So there are at least 2 or 3 security considerations that should make us take Afghanistan much more seriously, and particularly democratic Afghanistan, because they are our only strategic partners in Afghanistan. The Taliban can never be a substitute for, so to say, the post-2001 generation who feel some kinship and kindred feelings towards us. And lastly, on this question of division, Bismillah Khan has tweeted this. He has been attacked ferociously. Ahmed Masood has come out very clearly in favor of a national uprising. He says his cause is not just the Panjshir cause. It's not just the Tajik cause. It's a national cause. There may be some way to go that. Please remember that whoever it is, Afghanistan has always needed Kabul as its capital. And even in 96-2001, in order to recover the 10% of Afghanistan, which was controlled by Ahmed Shah Massoud, they lost Afghanistan. So any Afghan will want all of Afghanistan, and most certainly Kabul, because until then they can't say that they are in control of Afghanistan. So while I've never seen more talk about division, I would say that Afghanistan is actually, in spite of being a buffer state, in spite of being ethnically so distributed, the idea of Afghanistan is still that it's the one country where there are no separatist movements in the region, in South Asia and Southwest Asia.
Thanks, Muko. There are several questions that are there in the chat box, and I'm sorry we're running out of time now. But basically, I'll go to only a last question and to Rakesh. Rakesh, could you please unmute yourself? This is about somebody asking what is the difference between Taliban 1 and Taliban 2.0. Do you have any views on this, Rakesh?
Well, I think that, the whole exercise by Pakistan was with a view to convincing the world that, look, there is a Taliban 2.0, that this is a different Taliban. That was part of the process of getting a certain legitimacy to the Taliban. After all, they had given them safe haven sanctuary for almost since 2001. And eventually, there was a beginning was made when they opened an international office in Doha. They came out from under the shadows. Then began the process of engagement and the different processes that began. The Russians were engaging, the Iranians were engaging, the Chinese were engaging, the Europeans were engaging, and so on and so on. And there were a number of people in the West, as well as in Russia, as well as in Iran, who were saying, no, no, this is a different Taliban, this is a different Taliban. So this business of Taliban 2.0 gained a certain amount of currency. Then, of course, the Americans went into this so-called mythical deal, which they sold to the rest of the world as a peace deal, when essentially it was a withdrawal deal in return for safe passage. Now, but in order to sell that, they also had to say that this is a Taliban 2.0. But all the actions that the Taliban have taken since they have come in first, they have come in on the basis of military force. They've shown that. They've essentially not come in at the negotiating table. There is no power sharing. The cabinet they've announced is a hardline cabinet. You know, the Haqqani network, we've talked of all that. So clearly, this is nothing but a Taliban 1.0, which is a slightly more media-savvy Taliban 1.0, better packaged, but that's about it. So there is no Taliban 2.0. At least we see no evidence of it, and we should stop dreaming about it.
Thank you, thank you. We're really running out of time now, but let me now open it to the floor. Does anybody from there want to ask any specific question? Amrita Chima, somebody took your name. Would you like to ask something? You're looking very fancy in those glasses. Go ahead and ask.
You can all unmute yourselves, I think.
Everybody can unmute themselves now. Amrita, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Lovely to see many of you I haven't seen for ages, including Swash. I think the last time we met was in Oxford, which was many decades ago.
Yes.
This has been a fascinating session, and I want to thank all of you for your contributions. I'm interested in knowing, actually, the whole idea of a centralized Taliban system doesn't seem to work for me. There are just so many factions, and they all seem to be fighting amongst themselves. How likely is it that at some point, the hand that feeds you, they're going to go and kind of attack, let me put it differently. They will actually end up biting the hand that feeds them. With Pakistan, because you have a Taliban version in Pakistan. What about in the Uyghurs in China? Then you have, also in Central Asia, you have different groups. So at some point, is this danger, this general instability that you're talking about, will actually emanate from Afghanistan and radiate out? Because the Afghans have never cared about conquering other places, but this instability is fertile ground to let all these kind of groups, terrorist groups, actually radiate outwards and cause a great deal of instability.
Thanks, Amu. Would Mukho like to take that? Mukho, please go ahead.
Yeah. Amrita, thanks for that question. In fact, I have talked about, in the context of the scenarios, I actually think that, all these groups are so closely intertwined that, like it or not, and I said that they also have an external jihadi element, like it or not, given the fact that there are going to be differences between them, a lot of those differences will be lethal. I actually fear a kind of Iraq-Syria, Libya kind of situation, except much closer to the border. And this will have particularly strong regional implications, but also international implications. This is one. I think one point is there, I think people have completely misled about this whole idea of Taliban 2.0. Actually, Taliban 1.0 was not a terrorist organization. It was a religious militia. It was ultra-conservative. It was repressive, but it was not yet terrorist. It is in Taliban 2.0 under Pakistani control in Pakistan, starting from 2001, but growing from 2003, 5, 7, 10 onwards, that they have become radicalized. They have become suicide squads. They have used terrorism to intimidate and create fear amongst the Afghan people. In fact, Taliban 2.0 is now a terrorist outfit. Even in this particular year, the kind of atrocities that they have committed, for example, bombing maternity hospitals, girls' schools, Hazaras, targeted attacks against activists, including media, including one Indian, forced marriages, abductions. For all these activities, the ISIS in Iraq and Syria were bombed. And for all the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, the world declared war, or the US declared war on Saddam. Here we have a covert Pakistani invasion, which almost became overt at Panjshir, but the world is just simply looking on and is actually abetting a kind of situation where there'll be a new Iraq, Syria, Libya in Afghanistan. And these are very tough questions that you, Amrita, should pose the Americans. Why have they done this? Did they not know that Haqqani would be the commanding power in a Taliban takeover? In fact, why did they build up Sirajuddin Haqqani by offering him op-ed space in the New York Times and even project Anas Haqqani as a future leader? I mean,
thanks, Mukho.
This is extremely strong.
Wonderful. Thank you. We are finishing. We are finishing.
Can I
now.
make one quick comment?
Okay, last 1 minute to
One
each
last
three of you.
comment.
All three of you, 1 minute
Right.
each.
Actually,
Let me just-
Pitu, may I come in for a minute?
Mandy.
If you wanted to extend for another 5-7 minutes, it's not a big issue. If everybody is very engaged, we still have some leeway till 7, so you can, if you like. And can I just squeeze in one quick one to Mukho, please?
Yeah, go ahead, Mandy. Go ahead, Mandy.
Indeed, to Rakesh and Swash, that, Mukho, I like the wonderful idea about people-to-people contact and that strategy, which is kind of, in our world, the track 2, etc. Tell me, is there any formal engagement with the government today, with the Afghanistan desk or something, who might call upon you all as, great sort of fonts of knowledge, experience, etc.? Is there any formal engagement, and have you indeed asked, suggested any sort of track that you laid out for a people-to-people contact, etc.?
Rakesh is the master of this question.
His answer is no.
Well, absolutely. I mean,
I think we work through the media as far as possible.
Yeah.
Okay, we're down to last 2 minutes for each person.
I need to come back a little bit on what Mukho was saying about ISI. See, West Asia has been an integral part of whatever has happened in this whole business in Pakistan, been rooted. Arabs have come in, the money has come from Saudi Arabia. There is the Yinon plan, which you've all heard about. There's this Israeli diplomat who made a study in the 80s. It has led to systematic balkanization of different countries in the Gulf region. Iraq, Syria, de facto Lebanon, Yemen, North Africa. And this area actually maps it in. There are projections have been made which include both Iran and Afghanistan and going on to Pakistan. So what I'm saying is ISI and the Taliban have to be seen in the context of a West Asian perspective on this region. This is not a South Asian problem alone. It's not a Central Asian alone. The West Asia is an integral part of whatever happens there. Let's not forget that rabid Islam came to us, to our part of the region, from West Asia. So I think that's an area that needs some understanding, and I'd be grateful for both Mukho and Rakesh's comments on that.
Thanks, Mukho and Rakesh. Rakesh, go ahead.
thanks. Let me just say that there are different factions within Afghanistan. So I would say within the Taliban, of course, as Mukho said, you have the Doha group, you have the people from the Quetta Shura who've been obviously much more under control of Pakistan. You have the Haqqani network. And I would add a fourth Afghan group, which is actually the guys who've been doing the fighting on the ground. And it's very interesting that we saw some of those leading commanders whose names were earlier being tipped for important ministerial positions. They found they were nowhere on the scene, perhaps because they were not adequately receptive to ISI control or whatever. Then in addition to that, and I agree with Mukho, see, Taliban has an Afghan agenda, but unfortunately, there are a lot of other outfits operating there. Now, Al-Qaeda has a global agenda. Islamic State has a global agenda. They are not going to be content at limiting their activities to Taliban. They would like to use Afghanistan as a base to project outwards. The ETIM, their agenda is towards China, towards Xinjiang. The IMU, their agenda is towards Uzbekistan. the Khatibah Imam al-Bukhari, their agenda is towards Tajikistan, and so on and so on. So you've got a host of these guys who have agendas outside Afghanistan. For them, Afghanistan is just a safe place because there is an ideological affinity with the ideology that Taliban supposes. So that is the conundrum here that we need to be able to see now. How long it takes to work itself out in order to lead to fissures is difficult to say.
Thanks, Mukho. Would you like to add
Yeah.
something to that?
Yeah, firstly, I'd like to very strongly endorse the argument made by Swashwaran some time back. That Afghans are pretty normal people and they are not fundamentally Islamists. This is really, really true. And we should resist any stereotyping of this kind. Second, on this whole question of, I think a question has been posed here by Kriti, and she had a number of questions. Why do you think the Taliban 2.0 is seeking foreign recognition? The simple answer to that is they want money. In 2001, when I reopened the embassy, one of the most stark things was that for 5.5, 6 years that they were in power, there was not even the slightest bit of reconstruction, let alone development. And it was actually a slightest bit of reconstruction. There is some conversation going on behind. Anyway, no reconstruction, and it was actually very much Pakistan's agenda to keep Afghanistan backward, not just in terms of social codes, but actually in terms of economy. Now they are talking this language of geoeconomics, which is basically Pakistan towards Central Asia and China, and get Afghanistan under Chinese Pakistani control. But I think the most important point that I would like to make is that we have completely overlooked one thing, that Pakistan has conducted a 20-year hybrid war through the Taliban. In this 20-year hybrid war, they have used the following instruments: indoctrination of madrasa students in Pakistan, on the other side of the Durand line in Pakistan, indoctrination of mullahs, who they have then pushed into Afghanistan and tried to radicalize Afghans themselves. Gradual infiltration, embedding, and eventually shadow governments all over Afghanistan over the last 15 years. Then they have used psychological warfare, particularly using terrorism on a massive scale. They've used ICT and information warfare on a massive scale, capitalizing on every mistake that the Americans and the Afghan government have made. They have finally actually masterminded the military strategy, and including the diplomatic strategy, by which Afghanistan caved in completely, by which they secured the north and west first, and they won a war as prescribed by Sun Tzu without actually fighting. And this has been actually a very skillful and a kind of hybrid war, as Christopher Alexander has described it, which has completely escaped international attention. And I can't believe that the Americans, with all their intelligence and with the CIA and the MI6 in the UK, they were not aware of what is happening. And I think, there needs to be an investigation as to, firstly, this hybrid war, and secondly, how the United States and the UK simply did not see it coming. And, this has tremendous lessons for the future, because this is the most successful example of the hybrid war.
Okay, thanks so much, Shimoko. We have a last question from Qureshi Saab. Shri S.Y. Qureshi, could you please ask your question? Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Before the Russian invasion in 1979, the Afghans were happy-go-lucky, innocent people, though poor. After that, they have been a political chessboard of big power, big and not so big powers. Do you ever visualize a return to pre-1979 days of innocence?
Address to? Sorry, who's the question addressed to, Dr.
Okay. Go ahead. Mukho, go ahead. I'll follow.
Anyone.
Swash.
Okay. Qureshi Saab, I was there before this happened in the late 70s. I saw a different Afghanistan. We could travel. I drove to Quetta. I drove down the Khyber Pass. It was a very different Afghanistan. That Afghanistan can come back is our hope and our expectation. My innate belief is in the goodness and the sense of identity of the ordinary Afghan. He is not interested in the kind of polarization that is being forced on him. Neither the leftist one that the PDPA and the Soviet-led groups brought, or indeed this group has brought. It is, I think, today a fond hope. My sense is that if there is going to be an Afghanistan that comes back, it would come back more if there is a de facto, I'm not saying a formal, but a de facto division between those that live in the north and who share a much wider common sense of identity. And they will be able to share that with our friends, the Pashtuns, as well. Because the Pashtun is first a Pashtun. He was first an Afghan. He is not an Islamicist. And I think that is our hope for Afghanistan's future, provided we can keep these fellows out. We need to work against what Pakistan has done. It's done Afghanistan a great deal of disfavor. It's a crime against humanity. And I think we should take a position on that internationally.
Rakesh, any final views?
Well, I don't think it can come back to pre-79 because you can't. But yes, if the Afghans get agency, if they get autonomy, then it's possible. But Pakistan didn't start interfering in Afghanistan only from 1979 onwards. Pakistan started interfering in Afghanistan much earlier, because just as British India saw Afghanistan as a frontier, Pakistan also saw it as a frontier, though for different reasons. They saw it for other reasons because they had one live frontier with India. So they saw it as a frontier which they needed to have control over. And that
Thank you so much.
That obsession is the one that drives it.
Wonderful, wonderful. So thank you very much. And may I take a formal thank you to Swash, to Mukho, and to Rakesh for absolutely excellent session. Really, really good views. And I think we were able to share a lot amongst all of us here today, asking all kinds of questions and getting answers to at least some of them in some manner, and with the hope that we will do. Yes, Gautam, you have something final to say?
Just one point. Yes, I visited Afghanistan in 1977 when Yash was there, and he took us to Bande Mir and Bamiyar. But I would say that if we back the post-2001 generation, we might have an even more progressive, even more talented, and even more flourishing Afghanistan. The new generation of Afghanistan is absolutely brilliant. And I think I've
wonderful. Thank you. So on that very happy note, with great hopes for a future, especially for India playing an important role in it. Thank you for a very interesting discussion to everybody. May I thank Mandy as usual for getting this whole thing together. And of course, the principal St. Stephen's College and the Alumni Association, who've always backed us and invited many of you to join us today. And of course, our wonderful Pasreech, who always makes Zoom available for us to have these sessions. We will be announcing the next session pretty soon. We have Amitabh Kant as the next one, and we will keep you enthralled with lots of new things and stuff different from Afghanistan. Thank you very much. Bye. Good evening.
Bye-bye all.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Kruti.